I'm a 29-year-old guy, and this story involves my family, mainly my parents and my younger sister, Sophie, who's 25. For context, my family's pretty well off, but that's where the perks end for me. Let me take you back to when it all started going downhill. When I graduated college at 22, I was on a high, ready to start my life with a fresh degree and big plans. My parents, however, had different ideas. The day after I got my diploma, they sat me down and told me they were cutting me off financially. They said it was time for me to be financially independent and learn to fend for myself. It felt like a sucker punch because Sophie, who was just starting college, continued to receive full support from them. She got her tuition paid, an apartment covered, and a monthly allowance, while I was expected to sink or swim on my own. At first, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe they thought I was the older one and could handle it. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became. This wasn't about teaching me financial responsibility. It was about favoritism. Holidays and family gatherings were when things got really awkward. My parents would invite us all out for dinner, and when the check arrived, they'd look straight at me. I was expected to pay, even when I was barely scraping by with my entry-level job. Meanwhile, Sophie never once pulled out her wallet. It was like a running joke that everyone was in on except me. My parents would say it was because I was the man and should take care of it, but Sophie never got that same speech. I once asked why Sophie didn't have to contribute, and my mom just waved it off, saying, "Oh, she's still figuring things out." Apparently at 22, I was supposed to have everything figured out, while Sophie at 20 got a free pass. Growing up, Sophie was always the golden child. If she messed up, it was just a mistake, and my parents would rush to her defense. I remember once when she crashed her car, my dad was furious at first, but the next day he was at the dealership buying her a new one, saying it could have happened to anyone. Meanwhile, when I scratched my car parking it in our driveway, I had to pay for the repairs out of my own pocket. It was small things like this at first, but over time they piled up. Sophie could do no wrong in their eyes, and I was the one who needed to toughen up. Every time I brought it up, my parents would accuse me of being jealous or say I was overreacting. While I was working long hours trying to pay off my student loans, Sophie was living it up. She traveled to Europe to find herself, went on luxury shopping sprees, and posted about her weekends at fancy resorts. And guess who was funding all of it? Yep, my parents. I couldn't understand why they were so willing to keep bankrolling her lifestyle while they wouldn't even help me out with a loan for a security deposit when I moved out of their house. The kicker was when they paid for a lavish 25th birthday party for her at a 5-star restaurant, complete with a designer cake and a live band. When I turned 25, my birthday gift was a happy birthday text from them. The breaking point came last year during a family gathering. We were sitting around after dinner when my dad casually mentioned that Sophie's car needed expensive repairs. Without missing a beat, he turned to me and said, "Why don't you chip in to help your sister out?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had been on my own for years, scraping by and building my life from the ground up without a cent from them. I pointed this out, reminding them that they cut me off at 22 and told me I needed to be independent. My dad just shrugged and said, "Well, she's different. She needs our support." I snapped. I told them it wasn't fair that I was expected to help when I'd had no help myself. They brushed it off like I was being dramatic, and Sophie just sat there, looking smug. It was the first time I realized how deeply ingrained their favoritism was. After that night, I decided to go low contact with my parents. I stopped answering their calls and texts unless it was necessary. It wasn't easy, but I needed space from the constant pressure and guilt tripping. I focused on myself for the next few years. I worked hard, got promoted, paid off my student loans, and even managed to buy my own place. It felt like a huge achievement, especially knowing I did it all on my own. While I was making progress, Sophie's life took a nosedive. She quit her job after a few months, claiming it was too stressful. Her credit card bills started piling up, and she began relying entirely on my parents for everything. They paid her rent, her bills, even her credit card debts. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. A few weeks ago, out of the blue, my parents started calling and texting me. It had been a while since they'd reached out like this, so I knew something was up. When I finally answered, they danced around the issue for a bit before admitting it. They were in financial trouble. Sophie's lifestyle had drained a significant portion of their savings, and they were struggling to keep up. Last Sunday, they invited me over for dinner. It was tense from the start, and I knew they were building up to something. Finally, my mom put down her fork, looked me in the eye, and said, "We need you to help Sophie out. She's in serious trouble, and family helps family." I was floored. They had the nerve to ask me for money after cutting me off for years. I told them there was no way I was going to bail her out. I'd spent the last 7 years building my own life while they coddled her. I wasn't about to undo all of that. My mom started crying, saying I was being selfish and that I'd forgotten my family values. My dad joined in, saying he was disappointed in me. It didn't take long for the rest of the family to find out. Suddenly, I was getting messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins telling me I was in the wrong. As if that wasn't enough, Sophie sent me a long, angry text accusing me of being a terrible brother. She ended it by saying that if I didn't help her, she was done with me for good. And that's where things stand. I've never felt more conflicted, but one thing is clear, I'm not backing down this time. Update 1. Right after the blow-up at dinner, things escalated quickly. My phone buzzed with messages from my parents the next morning, demanding I come over for a family meeting. They insisted it was for the good of the family and that we needed to sort things out face to face. It didn't take a genius to realize this was a setup, but I decided to go anyway. I figured it was better to get this over with and hear them out. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. My parents sat on one side of the living room, looking grim, and Sophie was there too, her eyes red from what I assumed was a fresh round of tears. I took a seat, and before I could even say a word, my mom launched into it. She pulled out a folder and started going over Sophie's financial situation. That's when I learned just how deep the mess really was. Apparently, Sophie had racked up over $100,000 in credit card debt. She defaulted on her car payments and maxed out multiple store credit cards. Her shopping habits were out of control: designer clothes, luxury vacations, spa weekends, you name it, she charged it. The worst part? My parents had been covering her bills in secret for years, hoping she'd eventually get her act together. Once my mom finished laying it all out, she turned to me with this desperate look on her face. They needed me to help Sophie out to the tune of $50,000. They said she was on the brink of bankruptcy and that this was her last chance. My dad chimed in, saying they couldn't keep paying her bills without jeopardizing their own finances. He made it sound like this was my duty, as her big brother, to step in and save the day. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were asking me for $50,000 after cutting me off years ago, expecting me to pull myself up by my bootstraps. I told them there was no way I was going to give Sophie that kind of money. She's an adult who made her own choices, and she needed to face the consequences, just like I had. As soon as I said no, the room shifted. My parents looked at each other, and I could feel the temperature drop. My mom started tearing up, saying I'd forgotten my family values and how they had sacrificed so much for me growing up. She painted this picture of my childhood as if they had given up everything for me, conveniently ignoring the fact that they had cut me off at 22 without a second thought. Then, Sophie started in on the emotional manipulation. She started sobbing, saying she had nowhere else to turn. She claimed she'd hit rock bottom, that she was scared, and that our parents couldn't afford to help her anymore. It was an Oscar-worthy performance, but I wasn't buying it. I'd seen this act before. Whenever she didn't get her way, the tears would flow, and everyone would rush to comfort her. At this point, my aunt chimed in. I didn't even realize she was in the house, but she walked into the room, clearly ready to back my parents up. She started in on how I was being ungrateful and selfish. She reminded me of all the support I used to get from the family before I was cut off and painted me as the bad guy for not stepping up now. It felt like I was being ganged up on from all sides. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, my cousin 30M, who I hadn't seen in years, spoke up. He'd apparently been listening from the kitchen. He pointed out the obvious favoritism, saying it was unfair for my parents to expect me to bail Sophie out after they had let her life of luxury while I was forced to fend for myself. His support was unexpected, and it made the whole room go quiet for a moment. After that brief silence, my parents dropped the bombshell. They gave me an ultimatum: either I helped Sophie out, or I'd be cut out of their lives permanently. They said they wouldn't forgive me if I turned my back on her in her time of need. It was their way of saying, you're either with us or against us. I took a deep breath, looked them straight in the eye, and calmly told them I'd already made my choice. I wasn't going to be manipulated into giving up money I'd worked hard for, especially after they'd abandoned me financially when I needed it most. That's when Sophie exploded. She jumped up, yelling that I was selfish and that I didn't care about family. She called me heartless and said I was dead to her. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard that it rattled the windows. My parents just sat there, staring at me like I was the villain in this story. After that day, my parents made good on their threat. They stopped calling and texting me entirely. It was radio silence for weeks. Part of me felt relieved not to have to deal with their constant guilt tripping. But there was also a pang of sadness. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of whatever relationship we once had. Meanwhile, Sophie took the drama to social media. She started posting these cryptic messages about fake family and how she'd been betrayed by those closest to her. Friends and followers flooded her comments with sympathy, and she lapped it up. I knew better than to engage, so I ignored it. But it was hard not to feel frustrated watching her play the victim online. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from my dad. It was short and to the point. He said he was disappointed in me and that he had expected better from his son. It felt like a gut punch, but I didn't respond. I'd already made my stance clear. Just when I thought the dust was settling, I received an envelope in the mail. It was a legal notice. My parents were suing me, claiming I had promised to loan Sophie the $50,000 during our family meeting. They were taking this to court, and it looked like the fight was far from over. And that's where things are now. I guess we're headed for a legal showdown. Update 2. Getting the legal notice felt like a punch in the gut. I opened the envelope, and there it was, an official lawsuit from my parents. They were claiming I'd verbally promised to loan Sophie $50,000 during the family meeting. It felt surreal reading the legal jargon, essentially accusing me of going back on my word. The whole thing was a lie, but they were serious about taking it to court. It was clear they were trying to bully me into giving in. I knew I couldn't handle this on my own, so I immediately started looking for a lawyer. After a few calls, I found someone who seemed sharp and had experience with family disputes. During our first meeting, I laid everything out: the financial cutoff, the favoritism, the family meeting where I'd clearly said no to bailing out Sophie. My lawyer listened, then leaned back in his chair and told me we had a strong case if I could gather solid evidence. He advised me to get statements from anyone who was at the meeting. He also suggested I look for any texts, emails, or recordings that could prove I never agreed to the loan. That's when I remembered something. I had a recording on my phone. It was from the family meeting, mostly because I'd been paranoid about how it would go. I pulled it up, and there it was, clear audio of me refusing to help Sophie. My lawyer's eyes lit up when he heard it. While my lawyer started preparing our defense, he began digging into my parents' finances to see if there was any motive behind the sudden lawsuit. That's when he uncovered something unexpected. My parents had been using Sophie's debts as a tax write-off for their business. They'd claimed her as a dependent and reported her financial troubles as business losses. It explained why they'd been so desperate for me to cover her debts. They'd been benefiting from it financially. This discovery gave us leverage. Not only did it show that my parents were involved in some questionable financial practices, but it also made their lawsuit look like a desperate attempt to keep their scheme going. My lawyer was excited, saying this could turn the whole case in our favor. I decided it was time to let the rest of the family know what was going on. I dropped a message in the family group chat, explaining that my parents were suing me and why. It was like lighting a fuse. Within minutes, the chat exploded with messages. My aunts and uncles were stunned. Half of them couldn't believe my parents would take me to court, while the other half immediately jumped to their defense, saying I must have done something to deserve it. Sophie, of course, chimed in, acting like the victim. She claimed she was struggling with her mental health, and that I was abandoning her in her time of need. It was the same story she'd been pushing online, but now she was doubling down, making it seem like I was the villain for not helping her out. It wasn't long before Sophie took the drama to her social media accounts again. This time, she wasn't being cryptic. She posted a long, emotional message about how she was going through a severe mental health crisis, and that her own brother had turned his back on her when she needed him most. Her followers ate it up, flooding the comments with messages of support, calling me heartless and cruel. My lawyer saw the posts and advised me not to respond. He said it was better to stay quiet and let the evidence speak for itself in court. It was hard to watch the narrative spin out of control, but I trusted his advice. Just when it felt like the whole family was against me, I got an unexpected phone call. It was from my estranged uncle, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He distanced himself from the family a long time ago, and I never knew why. He told me he'd heard about the lawsuit and wanted to share something with me. He explained that my parents had pulled similar stunts before, using family members as financial pawns. He mentioned how they'd manipulated another relative into covering debts years ago, promising it was for the good of the family, only to leave them high and dry once the money was handed over. My uncle had cut contact after that and moved away to start fresh. He offered to testify in court if needed, saying he had no problem exposing my parents for what they were doing. It was the first real support I'd felt since this whole mess began, and it gave me a renewed sense of determination. A few days later, I got a call from my parents' lawyer. He sounded calm, almost smug, as he explained they wanted to offer a settlement. If I agreed to give Sophie the $50,000, they'd drop the lawsuit. He tried to frame it as a generous offer to avoid dragging this out in court. I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. They really thought I'd cave after everything they'd put me through. I told my lawyer about the offer, and he advised me to reject it outright. We had strong evidence, and now with my uncle's willingness to testify, we had a good shot at not only winning the case, but also exposing their financial manipulation. He said it was time to go on the offensive. I hung up the phone, feeling the tension rise. It was clear now, this wasn't just about money. It was about control, and my parents weren't used to losing. My lawyer started preparing a countersuit for defamation, using Sophie's social media posts and the newfound evidence about their tax scheme as part of our case. Just as we were wrapping up our meeting, my lawyer's assistant rushed in with a new document she'd found during a background check, a hidden bank account in Sophie's name with a significant amount of money stashed away. It was far more than what she'd claimed she needed, and it painted a very different picture of her financial crisis. The plot had officially thickened. We were no longer just defending against their claims, we were about to expose a much bigger scheme. The next move was ours, and I couldn't wait to see how this played out in court. Update 3. When the call from my parents' lawyer came through, I was ready. He started with the same spiel, how they wanted to resolve things outside of court, and how it was all just a big misunderstanding. Then he made the offer if I agreed to give Sophie a $50,000 loan, they'd drop the lawsuit. It was framed as a compromise, a way to end this family dispute without more drama. I didn't hesitate. I rejected the offer flat out. I made it clear I never promised a loan and wasn't about to be coerced into it now. The lawyer sounded surprised, almost like he expected me to cave. After that call, my lawyer suggested we double down on gathering evidence. We already had the recording from the family meeting, but he wanted more. I went through old texts, emails, and even social media messages, looking for anything that could back up my side of the story. While digging through my phone, I found another recording from a separate conversation with my parents months before the meeting. In it, they were pressuring me to help the family, but I'd clearly refused, stating I wouldn't be bailing Sophie out financially. I sent everything to my lawyer, who was pleased. The recordings would show a pattern of pressure and manipulation, but the real bombshell came when my cousin reached out. My cousin, who defended me during the family meeting, called me privately. He'd just learned something huge. My parents had secretly mortgaged their house to cover Sophie's debts. They hadn't told anyone, not even other close family members. They were counting on me to step in and save the day because they were on the brink of financial ruin themselves. It all started to make sense, the desperation, the lawsuit, the emotional blackmail. They weren't just trying to help Sophie, they were trying to dig themselves out of a hole they'd put themselves in by enabling her reckless spending. As if things couldn't get worse, I found out my aunt, the one who'd sided with my parents during the family meeting, had her own reasons for pressuring me. My cousin told me she was promised a cut of any money they got from me. Apparently, my parents had promised her a portion of the settlement if she helped convince me to pay up. It was a gut punch, realizing just how deep the manipulation ran. This wasn't just about family loyalty, it was a coordinated effort to use me as their financial safety net. I decided enough was enough. After discussing it with my lawyer, I shared my story anonymously on Reddit. I didn't use real names or specific details that could be traced back, but I laid out everything: the financial cutoff, the favoritism, the lawsuit, and the recent discoveries. The post blew up. It went viral almost overnight, getting thousands of upvotes and hundreds of comments. People shared their own similar experiences, and I realized I wasn't alone. It was overwhelming, seeing the support pour in from complete strangers who understood exactly what I was dealing with. The post didn't stay anonymous for long. Word got back to my parents that I'd shared our story online. They were furious, accusing me of airing our private family business and humiliating them. Sophie wasn't far behind. She posted a tearful video on her social media, claiming she was being betrayed by her own brother and begging her followers for help. Her video painted her as the innocent victim, and once again, the comments were filled with sympathy. It was frustrating, watching her spin the narrative, but I knew we had more than enough evidence on our side. While preparing for court, my lawyer uncovered another document. It was evidence that my parents had tried to alter their will. They'd planned to leave everything to Sophie, explicitly cutting me out unless I made amends by financially supporting her. It was a power move, an attempt to control me from beyond the grave, essentially saying, "Help Sophie, or you get nothing." It was manipulative, and it showed just how far they were willing to go. Not long after, I got a call from my mom. She was crying, saying she never meant for things to go this far. She begged me to drop the legal battle for the sake of family unity. She tried every trick in the book, from guilt tripping to emotional blackmail. I could hear the desperation in her voice, but I stayed firm. I told her I wasn't going to be the scapegoat anymore. I wouldn't sacrifice my hard-earned money to bail out Sophie yet again. My cousin, who had been one of my few supporters, came clean about something else. He confessed that Sophie had a long history of exploiting family members financially. She'd maxed out credit cards in other relatives' names, taken out loans she never repaid, and used sob stories to get money from anyone who would listen. This wasn't just a one-time thing, it was a pattern of behavior going back years. It was like peeling back layers of a rotten onion, and each layer revealed something worse. In response, my parents and Sophie doubled down. They started spreading rumors that I was mentally unstable, telling extended family I'd become erratic and prone to outbursts. Suddenly, I was getting concerned messages from relatives, asking if I was okay and if I needed help. It was infuriating, but I decided to keep quiet and let my lawyer handle it. Out of nowhere, an old family friend reached out. He'd seen my story and wanted to help. He shared messages from years ago where my parents openly discussed using me as a financial safety net once Sophie's spending got out of control. He offered to testify if the case went to trial, saying he couldn't stand by and watch them manipulate me any longer. With all this new evidence, my lawyer advised me to go on the offensive. We filed a countersuit for defamation and emotional distress. We had the recordings, the hidden mortgage, the altered will, and now the testimony from the family friend. It was a game changer, and I could tell the tide was turning. Then, out of the blue, Sophie sent me a message. It was filled with threats, saying she'd ruin my life if I didn't give in and help her. I forwarded it straight to my lawyer, who assured me it would be another nail in the coffin for their case. Just as we were getting ready to move forward with the countersuit, my lawyer found something new. There was a mysterious, hidden bank account under Sophie's name, with a significant amount of money in it. It was far more than she'd claimed to have, suggesting she might have been lying about her financial crisis all along. This case was about to take a very unexpected turn. Update 4. The courtroom was packed the morning of the trial. I walked in with my lawyer by my side, scanning the rows filled with family members. My parents were seated at the front, right next to Sophie. They avoided my eyes, staring straight ahead. Sophie looked confident, almost smug, like she already knew the outcome. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it. The proceedings began, and the lawyers presented their opening statements. My parents' lawyer wasted no time painting me as the selfish, estranged son who refused to help his sister in a time of crisis. He droned on about family values and broken promises, trying to tug at the judge's emotions. Then it was my lawyer's turn. He didn't hold back. He laid out a compelling argument, highlighting the years of financial manipulation and blatant favoritism. He presented our case as a classic story of a golden child being coddled, while the scapegoat was left to fend for himself. The judge looked intrigued, and I could see the shift in the room's energy. It wasn't going to be as simple as my parents had hoped. As planned, my estranged uncle was called to the stand. I hadn't seen him in years, but he nodded at me as he took his seat. The courtroom fell silent as he began recounting decades of financial manipulation by my parents. He shared stories of how they had used other family members in similar ways, convincing them to take on debt or give loans for the good of the family, only to leave them high and dry. The bombshell came when he mentioned a time years ago when my parents had almost bankrupted another relative by doing the same thing. He explained how they had used emotional manipulation and guilt to extract money, making it seem like it was the family's duty to help out. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the extent of the manipulation. Next up was Sophie. She took the stand, putting on her best tearful expression. She told a sob story about her financial struggles, claiming she had no choice but to rely on our parents because I had refused to help her. It was all crocodile tears and exaggerated drama. But my lawyer was ready. He started cross-examining her, pulling up her own social media posts. He showed photos of her shopping sprees, luxury vacations, and expensive dinners, all from the time she claimed to be broke. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as each photo contradicted her claims. Sophie's face turned red, and she stammered, trying to explain it away, but it was clear the judge wasn't buying it. Then came the big reveal. My lawyer presented the evidence of the hidden bank account under Sophie's name. He explained how we'd discovered it during the investigation, showing documents proving she had over $200,000 stashed away. It was money she'd siphoned from our parents over the years, all while pretending to be in financial distress. The room erupted in shocked gasps. My parents looked stunned, genuinely blindsided by the revelation. I watched their faces closely. They had no idea. Sophie had been deceiving them, taking advantage of their favoritism for her own gain. It was a turning point in the trial, and you could feel the shift as everyone realized who the real manipulator was. To drive the point home, my lawyer played the recording from the family meeting. The audio was crystal clear, my parents asking me to help Sophie, and me refusing, stating outright that I wouldn't be giving her any money. It directly contradicted their entire case, shattering their claims that I'd promised a loan. The judge looked at my parents, clearly displeased. Their credibility had taken a massive hit. When it was my turn to testify, I kept it simple. I described how I'd been cut off financially at 22, while Sophie continued to receive full support. I talked about my struggles to build a life on my own, working hard to pay off debts and buy my own home, all while watching Sophie live a carefree lifestyle funded by our parents. I explained how I'd been pressured, manipulated, and made to feel like the family scapegoat for years. The courtroom was silent as I finished, the weight of my words hanging in the air. After a brief recess, the judge returned with the verdict. The lawsuit was dismissed, and she ruled in my favor. Not only that, but she awarded me damages for defamation and emotional distress. My lawyer had done it. The courtroom murmured as the judge reprimanded my parents, calling out their manipulative behavior and warning them against bringing such frivolous cases in the future. As we left the courtroom, my mom had a full breakdown. She was sobbing, clutching at Sophie, who was trying to pull away. In a loud public outburst, she screamed at Sophie for lying to them, for taking advantage of their love and trust. Sophie, looking furious, yanked her arm away and stormed off, refusing to speak to anyone. My father approached me outside the courtroom. He looked defeated, shoulders slumped, and admitted he hadn't known the full extent of Sophie's lies. He said he'd been blinded by his favoritism and apologized, but I didn't let him off the hook. I told him it was too little, too late, and walked away. In the following weeks, the fallout was massive. Extended family members reached out, split down the middle. Some apologized, admitting they'd believed the lies, while others still sided with Sophie, refusing to see the truth. Sophie's reputation took a nosedive. Her lies were exposed online, and people who once defended her started distancing themselves. Friends unfollowed her, and her social media went silent. A few days ago, I received a letter from my parents. It was a long, emotional plea for forgiveness. They promised they'd cut Sophie off financially and wanted to make amends. I read it, but I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure if I can ever trust them again after everything that's happened. Just when I thought it was over, I found a note tucked inside the envelope from my father's letter. It was cryptic, almost like a riddle, hinting at a long-hidden family secret that could change everything. It wasn't clear what it meant, but one thing was certain: this story isn't finished yet. Update 5. The cryptic note from my father kept nagging at me. It was short, almost like a riddle, mentioning a hidden gift from the past meant for the future. I couldn't shake the feeling there was more to it, something they'd kept from me for years. I decided to hire a private investigator to look into it. If there was a secret inheritance I needed to know. The investigator got back to me within a week. The findings were explosive. My late grandparents had set up a trust fund in my name years ago. It was meant to secure my future, and was substantial enough to change everything. But here's the kicker: my parents had blocked access to it right after I graduated college. They'd hidden it away, leaving me to struggle while they funneled money into Sophie's extravagant lifestyle. The trust fund was never meant for her. It was set aside specifically for me. My investigator showed me documents proving it was all intentional. My parents had kept the trust fund a secret, using legal loopholes to maintain control over the money. They'd planned to keep it hidden until I proved my loyalty by supporting Sophie financially. This wasn't just about favoritism anymore, it was about control. Armed with the evidence, I decided it was time for one final confrontation. I showed up at my parents' house unannounced. They seemed surprised to see me, especially after everything that had happened in court. I laid the documents out on the table, pointing out the proof of the trust fund and how they'd blocked it. For the first time, they looked genuinely defeated. My mom started crying, saying they'd only done it to protect the family and make sure Sophie had a better start. My dad admitted they'd thought I didn't need it because I was already doing fine on my own. It was a weak excuse, and we all knew it. They'd hidden the inheritance to keep control over me and give Sophie every advantage, no matter the cost. I walked out without another word and headed straight to my lawyer's office. We filed the paperwork to reclaim the trust fund the very next day. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. My parents had lost their grip on me, and they knew it. Shortly after, I heard through the family grapevine that they'd finally cut ties with Sophie. Her betrayal, especially the hidden bank account, had been the last straw for them. It took a few weeks, but the judge ruled in my favor. The trust fund was awarded to me in full. It was a surreal moment. Years of legal battles, manipulation, and lies had led up to this. I felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow as I walked out of the courtroom for the last time. I'd won, but the cost was the complete breakdown of my family. After the ruling, I made the decision to go permanently no contact with my parents and Sophie. I blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, and removed myself from every family group chat. It was time to move on. The relief was immediate, like a weight I'd carried for years was finally lifted. With the trust fund, I had the chance to start fresh. I relocated to a new city, somewhere far from the drama and bad memories. I bought a small house and started a new venture I'd always dreamed of. It was a nonprofit organization focused on helping victims of financial abuse, something I now understood all too well. I shared my experience on Reddit, posting an update to my original thread. I talked about the secret inheritance, the courtroom battles, and my decision to cut ties. The response was overwhelming. The post went viral again, with thousands of upvotes and supportive comments. People shared their own stories of manipulative families, thanking me for speaking out. It felt like a huge weight off my shoulders to finally tell the whole story. The messages of support were incredible. Strangers from all over reached out, offering encouragement and sharing their own experiences. It was validating to know I wasn't alone and that my story had helped others feel seen. I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. A few days later, I received a handwritten letter from my father. It was a sincere apology, the kind I'd wanted for years. He admitted they'd been wrong and that their actions had been driven by fear of losing control. He begged for forgiveness and promised they'd cut Sophie off for good. I read the letter once, then folded it up and put it away. I didn't respond. It wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about prioritizing my own healing. With the inheritance, I was able to fully fund my nonprofit. We launched programs to help victims of financial abuse gain independence, offering legal aid and financial education. It felt good to use the money for something meaningful, something that could actually make a difference. I also donated a portion to a charity focused on mental health support, knowing that Sophie's manipulations had taken a toll on everyone involved. Out of the blue, my estranged uncle called me again. He congratulated me on winning the case and hinted that there were more secrets buried in the family's past, things he hadn't revealed yet. He offered to share them if I wanted to know. I thought about it for a moment, then politely declined. I'd had enough of family secrets and drama. It was time to move forward. I deleted the family group chat from my phone for good. It felt symbolic, like closing a door on a chapter of my life that had been filled with manipulation and betrayal. I felt lighter, freer than I had in years. Just when I thought I'd heard the last of her, Sophie sent one final message. It was a half-hearted apology, filled with excuses and vague promises to do better. I didn't reply. I blocked her number and moved on. I ended my Reddit post with a message I wish someone had told me years ago. Stand up for yourself, set boundaries, and don't let family guilt you into sacrificing your own well-being. Family loyalty isn't worth your peace. As I hit the submit button, I felt a sense of closure. I'm excited for this new chapter of my life. For the first time, I'm free from the web of manipulation my family had spun around me. I'm choosing peace, and it feels like the best decision I've ever made.